Good afternoon, everyone. We'll just give one more minute to get started. Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the next installment of our 2020-2021 discussion group speaker series, part of the Canadian Institute of Mining Management and Economics Society. My name is David Robson. I'm the chair of the committee that organizes these events. And I'm very pleased to welcome Siri Genik with us today, who will be sharing her views on supply chain and mining, and sometimes the small things matter most. Before we get started, I'll just do a few housekeeping items. In your screens, there's a chat button and a Q&A button, and the Q&A is where we'd like you to ask any questions that we'd be happy to answer at the end. And the chat features for just general chat if you want to give comments or say hi to anyone. We'd also like to thank our sponsor, the Schulich School of Business and the Executive Education Center, who's graciously hosted us on their platforms this today. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Siri Genik. She's the principal and founder of consultancy Bridge Consult, and she's, I guess, worked all over the world, Canada, in Asia, South America, formerly with major EPCM firms, and we're pleased to have her with us today. I will turn it over to you, Siri.
Thank you, David. And I actually remembered to unmute the button to avoid you're on mute. So good afternoon, everybody. This is a true pleasure. Thank you to CIM MES for the invitation. CIM is really close to my heart, and it's an absolute pleasure to spend the afternoon, or at least a little bit of this beautiful afternoon in Toronto with you. The topic of our conversation this afternoon is mining supply chain, which in itself is probably not the most exciting topic unless you wonder why we talk about paper bags and washing machines and how that applies to the mining supply chain. So Dave, if you wouldn't mind showing the next slide. So maybe David can tell us a story to get started, and I'll take it from there.
Yeah, thanks, Siri. Yeah, just very quickly, when Siri and I first started discussing this idea around supply chain, a story came to me of a mine I used to work at. It was a remote mine site, far away from everything, and supply chain very important. And sometimes you think of supply chain as the big items, the big pumps and fans and stuff to keep the mine and mill going. But in this case, it was just something as simple as the brown paper bag where miners would pack their lunches to take to the mine away from the camp. And it happened that we ran out of them, and all kinds of chaos ensued. And it's just sometimes the littlest things make a huge impact on this mine site. So $25,000 an hour was the revenue generating from this mines, and in any little hiccup towards achieving that was acutely felt.
Thank you, David. So a very small story about a very inexpensive item. COVID has brought everything to a standstill in many respects. We're sort of used to it now, a year into the pandemic, which is pretty sad really when you think about it, but starting to get excited again with those vaccines. But when this hit us this time last year, just about, the world came to a stop everywhere. And it put everybody, big and small, large and powerful, smaller and local, on a level playing field. what did come to a stop overnight were all our supply chains. And it didn't have to be just mining, it was just absolutely everything. So you saw the people, the toilet paper, the paper towel, the Lysol wipes, and so on and so forth. They did continue to produce all these goods and services in many respects. So the resiliency, the each part of the world would continue to produce. The agility of the system wasn't there. Well, what do you do when overnight you can't get a paper bag? So as David mentioned, $25,000 an hour, you calculate a couple of $1 million later, something as silly as making sure you had an ability to get your lunch into a bag and work at site brought an organization to a much slower stand. So what do you do when you can't find that? When trade is not uplifted, but upheaved, when you've had governments and organizations who decide they're no longer trading, not just China, but UK and the rest of Europe, um, Middle East, Far East, India, uh, all of these supply chains came to a halt. And so if you can't produce and you're a mine, or if you can't operate, or if you can't keep exploring, you all of a sudden you're burning money. And burning money affects bottom lines and ultimately shareholder value beyond the productivity and your schedules and your permits. So in the industry, certainly in mining and where I started, which was contracting and procurement, the adage was just in time. Make sure that you get things exactly when you need them to hand them over to the next contractor, the next service provider, tag it and hand it over. Today, we know that that means just too late. And we're now thinking about just in case. So that one little piece of that one paper bag or that one box of paper bags or that one fan belt or that one pump that you were told just keep one and maintain and quickly get off the shelf until you need the next one doesn't work anymore. So now what does just in case looks like? That means we need more, but where do we get it from? What does more look like? Next slide, Dave, please. So what are the key questions that we need to ask ourselves, knowing that we're now in a totally volatile and certain, so you've heard the acronym VUCA, totally upside down world is something I'm more comfortable with. How do we make sure we can react? We can react efficiently, but also proactively and without stress or panic. So some of the key questions in understanding how to move forward, I would like to suggest to you are what does a supply chain mean to your organization, to your mine, to your exploration company, to your drilling rig, to your any of your activities within the mining industry? Who makes up the organization's ecosystem? And we'll get into the detail. But up front, the mining company is just one piece of a broader landscape. So understanding where we fit, what is our impact, what is our role, and how the roles of others will come and impact us is important. One that is obvious, but I find needs to be repeated, where are the risks located? So again, successful supply chain management can be simply the proper allocation and management of risk, but you have to do the exercise. Why think of innovation, AI, technology, and digitalization? Why are they important? And do we do everything? Do we go full blockchain and full systems, or what do we do? And then finally, and importantly, when should ESG be included in the new approach to the supply chain agility? So just so we're clear, ESG has or should have been always within the organization. Hopefully it is, and it continues to be. So when is the right time and how should we go about making sure that that is also part of the conversation? So let's look at some of the answers, and the next slide, please. So, what the supply chain means to your organization. This is really simply meaning, as an organization, as a leader in that organization, do you understand the landscape that's around you? And so, in any one of you on this call this afternoon, do you know geographically where you're located? And it seems silly, but broader than just the straight place of where your site is, but your communities, both your indigenous, of course, communities, but your business communities and your broader world. So, are there unions? Are there NGOs? Are there civil society? Who is the government? Which level of government? Understanding all of those are really, really important. Leadership is one of the key stakeholders that sometimes we forget about, but at the end of the day, between your board and your leadership, they set the tone, they set the business strategy. So now supply chain needs to be at the table. COVID brought two big pieces of certainly mining, but probably in other spaces as well. Two big areas to the forefront of the conversation: talent, so people, the importance of quality people and looking after your people, and supply chain. And when you think of it, without the people and what goes into building or operating what you're working on, the rest is sort of irrelevant. So what you really need is to make sure that you now have obviously talent at the table. So your HR, but that's not our conversation for today, but that you do have the leadership at the table for supply chain. And you understand its strategic role. So yes, you're building. So I'll take an example. You're building an iron ore mine in Nunavut, and you basically need a really big conveyor belt because it's a wealthy asset. You stockpile it, you crush it, put it on a conveyor, and then load vessels that then ship it out. So that's basic. So you need you can break down a conveyor belt, and probably most of us around the screen can do that. Understanding that if that conveyor belt breaks down and cannot be fixed within a certain amount of time, the impact on schedule, on loading vessels, on your budget, on productivity, and eventually on shareholder becomes really obvious. So of course somebody will say, well, how hard is it to repair a conveyor belt? Well, it probably isn't very hard until you've lost that one particular piece that comes from the company in Germany, which again, how hard can that be? Well, during COVID, we have to remember that most flights in and out of Canada were stopped for a period of time, and were certainly cut down. That you just couldn't fly in from Germany, let's say, without doing a 14 day, although it did feel like 14 weeks probably for some people, quarantine. So understanding the risk of those, where are those strategic pieces to that particular piece of equipment becomes very important. And it is, so you don't have to know exactly, but you do have to make sure when you're at the leadership table that you understand that we may no longer be able to rely on outside of geographic areas because of the restriction due to the pandemic. And right now, we don't know what that looks like. It keeps changing. Things that we used to get out of the European community now have changed because of Brexit. You've got challenges with different ports around the world. Again, issues around, of course, China and India. So you have to have a really clear understanding. And I will put to you that many leaders didn't always have a full understanding of what exactly was part of the building and the operations of their ongoing activities, and also where the weak points were. Part of the mining ecosystem. So again, your mining company is part of what I like to call a mining ecosystem. So you're drawing on different communities. You may or may not be, or you may not have been always calling upon the communities to provide equipment, to provide different services, perhaps because your organization was used to using something you'd always worked with in the past, and perhaps not necessarily looking at what you had within the environment in which you were functioning. So the people that come to work within your company are part of that ecosystem. They have families who also use obviously the broader services, the indirect and often the induced um, jobs that are related to the mine. And again, all of a sudden, because our worlds have been shaken because of the pandemic, what are the impacts? So that is something that we need to think about. So then, how do you build that ecosystem and understand it? It's also by drawing your value, a flow chart of your value chain. And you understand the full gamut. So from the very smallest part. So maybe it's that paper bag, maybe it's that screw, maybe it's that leather fan belt, all the way to that electric car, because the electric car that somebody will buy eventually has got some lithium or some nickel or some zinc or some scandium or heaven knows what. And so you have to be really aware of whom you're selling your asset to, but also where it comes from. The reality being, of course, that if you can't deliver to your ultimate off-taker, there are going to be frustrations and issues. And also, if you don't properly treat the suppliers and the contractors and the service providers, and that comes to reflect on who you are as an organization, that will eventually also come to reflect on the vehicle that you may be purchasing, or the company that's fabricating it, or perhaps if you're buying diamonds, of course, or precious stones, the manner in which the precious stones have been provided, and or the gold for that matter, the silver. So you no longer are, when you're operating a mining asset, just a mine. You are now part of a much bigger landscape, a bigger process. And when you fall apart or have difficulty functioning, you can find that the whole system in which you're functioning also may have difficulties. So if you don't want that to happen, you do need leadership tone from the top. What does my business strategy involve, and how do I make sure that when I need help I can get it? How do I build partnerships? How do I build cooperation? How do I build relationships with all of my providers within my landscape to ensure that when times are difficult for my company as well as perhaps their own, there's a way to manage through it? And we've seen some companies do it very, very well. And that is what I call laying the foundation of long-term value, stewardship, and sustainability, is that you understand that it's not just supply chain, or sometimes they call it contracting or procurement, is not just a grocery list of this is what I need. I can go to the warehouse and buy it and make sure that it's there, but understand the broader picture of what supply chain means to the organization. Next, please, Dave. Slide. Thank you. So when we talk about this ecosystem, what we're really talking about, most of you are familiar with this, are the stakeholders. So basically, draw a stakeholder map. And it's not really complicated. Understanding you have two kinds of stakeholders, and never forgetting, I believe, certainly the most important, the internal stakeholders. So we talked about talent. You saw many mining companies make sure when COVID hit early months last year, March, April, May, the companies turn around, make sure their employees were okay, make sure they had PPE if they were still working at site, making sure that the indigenous communities stayed at home to make sure they were protected, they would not get sick because the medical facilities may not have been up to the needs or the requirements should anybody get sick, continuing to pay full salary. That for me is just as much part of your supply chain, your internal supply chain. Those are the wheels that make the operations work. And those decisions were made over a question of days. They didn't take 3 months to evaluate and to look at a lot of charts. People, leadership made very clear decisions about how do we make sure our people are okay. If our people are okay, the rest will follow. That empathy, which is really important, becoming more and more important, starts at the top. So the vision from the leaders are making sure everybody is okay. What do they need? Do they need to stay home? What does that look like? So of course we all moved from offices downtown or wherever we were working, but some people had to go back and forth from site. What did that mean? How do you protect families when your father, your mother, your brother, your sister fly in, fly out? So those were the first requirements, and that's important. So that vision from the top, so important. You're part of the decision making process. So now that you're understanding that the importance of talent in your staff, what happens to procurement that's fallen apart? Well, before you can even get anybody to site, of course, we know that we had to find PPE, we had to find masks, hand sanitizers, face coverings, testing kits, or the ability to seclude certain people because they had tested positive until they were sure that they were not symptomatic. So all of this was sort of a layer on top of the normal supply chain. And what happens if you can't get those PPE? And you saw the mining companies really turn on a dime, and we really should be proud of this, doing what they could to find the PPE, but also sharing it within the communities, sharing it to the contractors, to the providers, to the unions, to the people, regardless of whether they were internal or external stakeholders, making sure everybody was okay. You know what? When the ship is sinking, you want to make sure everybody gets into those lifeboats. The rest will follow. That also forced leaders, the leadership team, to understand what that supply chain process meant. So, who do we call on? Um, how can we call on them? And how can we rely on them when hand sanitizer will, or PPE or mask will not come from China anymore? How do we work on the ground? How do we understand the interfaces, the impacts? And it's not just the contracting and contracting and procurement team or the supply chain people. It's the technical men and women. It is the engineering teams. It is the HR teams. It is legal. It's CSR. It's everybody all together understanding how they interface and how they can help. And that's a big shift. Supply chain is no longer sort of that department at the end of the hall, usually next to legal and just before CSR. It really truly is part of the strategic decision making, because who you call in to help you is going to become an important component of how you're going to be able to deliver. And of course, you're talking about talent, and I do talk about it a lot because I think it's really core, is that all of a sudden the old methods that we used up until, again, the 17th of March of last year may no longer be sufficient. You need to understand what supply chain is, how it works, but the concepts of the lean systems and all these different approaches may no longer, those processes may no longer apply. You need a couple of things. You need to certainly upskill, so that we're now talking about the different systems around technology, artificial intelligence, and we'll see in a little while. It also may mean collaborating on purchasing of certain pieces of equipment with other companies that are close by, or mining assets that are close by, because sharing a pump when you have two is not going to necessarily put your colleague into bankruptcy or give you a competitive edge. It might just be that safety boat that helps save you, and develop stronger bonds within the mining community. So that's something to think about as well. The external stakeholders probably more obvious, but the ones we don't always think about in the mining industry are the upstream, the ultimate consumers. So if it's whether it's nickel or gold or copper or zinc or all the lithiums and all the critical minerals, we need to remember what our mineral or metal is going to be a part of. So it'll probably be more and more, hopefully, within the renewable energy system. It'll be for all of our wonderful technology, our computers, our phones, tablets, what have you. But you're seeing a huge concern about how these goods are being produced, and there's an increased concern about making sure that the pieces that make them up, that are part of the composition of your laptop or what have you, um, have a sourcing story that is sustainable. And it doesn't mean green from the paper bag all the way up, but it means a sustainable approach to how those that metal comes to be included, or that mineral comes to be included in your vehicle or your iPad or your tablet, rather, whatever. And downstream, of course, the smallest part. So back to this paper bag, which literally, from Dave's story, brought the operations almost to, or certainly to an important slowdown for a couple of days, until people could find a way to get their lunches to the different areas of a site. And for those of us who have been to site and have been in remote areas, and you may all be, for all I know, somewhere far away, I can tell you that the two things that are really important, besides missing your family, obviously, is food and internet. And when one of those fall off, you're pretty cranky. So, trying to figure out what you're going to carry your lunch in to get to site and be able to have a lunch break, becomes a huge issue, and it will affect productivity. And it's important. I mean, there's obviously all the psychology around food, but it's just all of a sudden, I've seen it happen. And then you go and get the next plastic bag, but yet you'd sworn plastic away. So again, supply chain becomes, you zoom out, sorry for the term, but and then understand the impact. So the target is renewable from end to end, and that'll be within reason. But also globally, make sure you understand all the interfaces and the impacts. And that's where we, just as we finish this slide, is that you're back to the top. It's top down, but it's also bottom up. You need that conversation to keep rolling, to understand when things fall off, how do you make sure we can put them back on, and very quickly. Time has been accelerated all of a sudden as well. So you don't always have the luxury of, well, we'll wait for the next bundle of paper bags, because you know what? There ain't any planes that are flying in from wherever, because the flights have been canceled. So if you're out in the East Coast, many of you will know that many flights have been totally or almost completely canceled. Halifax or New Brunswick. So, you can't, what we took for granted up until a year ago, now it just, where do you get that next paper bag? So if you, by extension, take it to any other of the components, even the most ordinary ones, screws, pumps, what have you, certainly a challenge. So a different way of thinking about it. Next slide, please. So I talked about risks. Proper and good supply chain means basic good risk assessment. And it sounds really simple, but I find that it's something I find myself doing over and over again. It is a priority. You need to understand more than ever how to de-risk your supply chain. And it's that back to that wheel that keeps on turning. If you can't do that, or you don't do that, rather, you're not adapting to change. I hear a lot of people say, oh, don't worry about it. Yeah, no, I know it's a pain. We'll get those paper bags, get those bolts, get those pumps. Yeah, no, for a couple of months it'll be tough, but then when we go back to normal, we'll be okay. So this is a news flash. it's not going to be back to what it was before. It will be okay for sure. I really believe that. But it is not going to be back to what it was like before the 17th of March, 2020. It is going to be very different. So we need, and our mining industry isn't always nimble in adopting change. It creates a certain amount of insecurity for all of us. I have a hard time with technology. It's always stressful for me. And when you're working on a much huger scale, it becomes that sense of unknown becomes foreboding. So you need to understand where they are ahead of time and what your plan B, C, and D is going to be. So again, we're back to looking at your environment, to who are the communities close by, what is possible, what is impossible, and how do you mitigate? And that probably means a lot of reverse engineering. You will find very often that there are a lot of people close to you who are able to help, who can provide equipment, who can provide services, who can fix things that you had never thought of before for a whole host of reasons. But they are also, remember, what you're going through, everybody's going through. So organizations are retooling, they're rebuilding. We saw it with so many companies, again, in the beginning of the pandemic, retooling their assembly lines to create masks and sanitizer and anything that was needed for the pandemic and is still needed. So, and it didn't take very long. And even, I mean, the vaccine, when you think of it, not only vaccines and understanding how to protect against a virus takes more than 12 months. And we've been able, the global community, and I know it's not perfect, but has started coming up with solutions within less than a year. So these are the ability to turn around, but also to think globally. So not only locally, but in this case, people, the companies went to the outside, to the rest of the world, and brought in knowledge and science. So that is the reverse. But it also, again, they did their risk assessments. How do we find things quick? Well, the more of us that look at for a solution, the quicker it's going to be. The other conversation that I'm hearing about that I'm very excited and pleased about is that in those remote locations, in those indigenous locations where it is difficult to be able to share either PPE or even getting vaccine, I'm hearing that many mine companies are starting to talk, obviously, with the government at different levels to be the ones to help and support. So again, think it isn't part of what we would normally do as an industry, but also as an industry, we've always stepped up, and that is true. And so it's good to see that we're thinking in those terms to bring health to the community, to bring comfort to the community, and in the end, back to that ecosystem. The healthier everybody is, everybody can get back to a, I hate to say normal, but to a better, more comfortable working environment. That means working with all of your providers, your suppliers, your contractors, understanding what they're going through. So we saw a lot of that happening with the mining companies as well, was companies that supplied mining companies were unable to get their own supply chains going, or things were not being delivered, or they were behind, or they were financially in huge difficulty because margins being small, jobs being canceled. All of a sudden, these companies that you relied on for so many years were having their own difficulties. So we saw many mining companies step up and go, okay, if we can pay you in a forward way, if we can support you, can you support us? So all of a sudden, you're not talking about us versus them and the cheapest guy in town, or but really partnerships, cooperation, and people all together helping each other so that your mining operations continue, but at the same time the supply chain that you rely on is now pumping oxygen again and being able to feed their subs and all the way down to that original paper bag or fan belt that I like, or even in some respect the rubber that's part of the fan belt. So the flip side, of course, of that is that if you have a flawed supply chain, it doesn't take very long for your own brand and your own reputation to be affected. And eventually you do lose, excuse me, that local support. So what goes around comes around. Sometimes it takes time, but I, I think I really like the saying that just we're all in this together, and we are. We're all going through the same thing. So helping each other out just makes sense. It's as simple as that. And that's, for me, the way that you want to look at managing risk and mitigating risk at the supply chain level. Next slide, please. So I talked about, you heard me talk about innovation. You're hearing AI, technology, digitalization, and why are they important? Well, because we won't be, again, we're not going to be doing things the same way as we used to. Now is, and it is because of the pandemic, but also because this is forcing us to rethink how we do things. And technology, artificial intelligence, digitalization, all of these different approaches help us look at supply chains in a completely different way. It had started. This is not new. It hasn't come up just with COVID, but it has been exponentially accelerated. So you're seeing in places like Africa, companies coming together using blockchain to provide you with different spare parts or equipment that the mining industry needs that do not provide, I wouldn't say competitive edge, because as long as you have the equipment, you are competitive, but there's no technology secret. So again, the pumps, the different pieces, and so it's pooling the information, and that pool is done through these companies that use blockchain to understand where the different spare parts are, where they can be sourced or procured from, where they can be found in any at any given time, how long it would take to get them and deliver them to your door or to your site, what have you. It takes a mind shift in the industry in general to say, I'm comfortable with buying that way. Now, again, I do insist this is not for the technology or the process parts that are sensitive, um, but it's for most of the other parts that are not. And so we need to look at that and think of that. And as we build our companies moving forward, and we talked earlier about upskilling our talent and what it takes to be into supply chain today for tomorrow, you're now looking at a different way of procuring. Again, back to not just in time, back again, not to cheapest or least expensive, but really, what do I need for when, and is there a way I can do it without affecting delivery times? Certainly something that needs to be looked into. And not everything is a solution for everybody, by the way. So I did bunch them up or put them in this one bucket for this one slide. But innovation will be different for your organization from the next. Innovation could be bringing in talent from different areas than mining that have skill sets that we need that you don't normally, for digitalization, for example. How does artificial intelligence make a difference? Where do you put it? So you're starting to see systems thinking, smart mining, and supply chain falls right smack in the middle of that. So you need to create that awareness and to be on board if you want to be ahead of the curve. Because those companies that are, and you don't need to be part of the majors. There are many ways that you can do it that are available right now. It's a question of understanding it and or even developing it in-house possibly. But you will need to be ahead of that curve because those who are will take over. It's definitely as simple as that. And so to the comment I've made earlier, there are a number of areas in supply chain where we might want to think about cooperating and collaborating rather than competing. And so again, a novel approach. It's starting, I've seen it done. I've seen it done actually in Africa. I've seen it done in South America. It just makes sense. Not everybody needs everything at the same time. Not everybody has huge warehouses or the need for huge warehouses, by the way. Maybe we just need one warehouse where everything is located, and then the ability to be able to, through digitalization or technology, be able to purchase. So again, around thinking about a different way of doing mining, around renewable, about a more sustainable approach, something to think about. And it's developing. So I certainly don't have all the answers, but I wouldn't want to have this presentation without sharing that I have seen it. I've seen it work, and it's pretty exciting and it's pretty new. And if you want more information, I can certainly share it with you if that's something that is of interest to you. Next slide. So I would venture to say probably my favorite one about ESG and sustainability. When should ESG, or I'm often asked, well, when should ESG be included in this approach to supply chain and being agile? And pretty much, if we went back to the first slide, at the beginning. So the tone comes from the top. Sustainability, ESG is part of the way you do business. It isn't, and I'll come to this at the end of the slide, it isn't just a report. And I'm not belittling the report, but don't mix the tool, which is the report, with the overarching strategy of what sustainability should be and how it should work for your business model. So again, there is no one model. There's a lot of acronyms out there, and granted, it is confusing, but it needs to make sense to your business, and it needs to be something you can work with and you can integrate not only into your business and your business delivery, but also obviously into your supply chain. And I really believe that will help you be a lot more agile. So I talked about zooming out, understanding your landscape. Now I'm saying zoom in, understand what you are building or what you're operating, its location and its long-term impact. And these are questions that you should ask yourself regularly. Obviously, you're operating a gold mine, you're operating a silver mine, copper, open pit, underground. Technology is moving faster than we can even understand. So the way we built things even a year ago is no longer the way we're going to be building them next year. Um, the components, the approach, the way, the impacts, and the long term impact. So there is technology. There are ways for us to make sure we understand our impact, obviously, on the environment. And most of us, if not all of us, do that. I know we do. The water tables, the dust in the air, the SO2, all of those things. I know we're aware, but the as technology develops, information develops, how can we continuously do better? So it is a continuous improvement process. Um, and there may be areas where we can't, and that's fine too. And there may be no ability within our supply chain to find those components that we need to be perfect. So perfection is something we want to obviously always tend to, but the reality is that our industry is far from perfect, not because we're not good, quite to the contrary, but because we also have to, we have to be pragmatic, but we also have to be able to explain it. So that's where the transparency comes in. But as long as we give ourselves the tools to understand what we're building, its impact on the environment, the impact on the social. So where we used to buy perhaps over the from across the oceans, locally it may make a lot more sense. And local can mean, again, a lot of different things at a different time. It may be that as you're building, if you're in the building phase of your asset, you're working with tier one contractors because it's a major asset, and of course you do want to make sure you work with people who have the experience and the depth of knowledge. And one of the areas where I've seen this happen and covers sort of all three of this top point about understanding what you're building was when we were building Konyambo, New Caledonia. And originally, our approach had been working with tier ones internationally from around the world, because those people we believed were the best and had the ability to deliver on our schedule and hopefully on our budget. Um, the challenge was that the local government had decided, once we started the exercise of building, that they wanted everybody from New Caledonia to be part of the process. And there are only about 250,000 people in New Caledonia, most of which at the time we were building Kanyambo were on Goro. So there wasn't a lot of skilled workforce. And we were told, well, you need to work with what you have. And so we did bring in our tier ones and we said, help us. We need to upskill, we need to train. So you don't have to do everything yourself, and you don't have to certainly be the size of Konyambo, but the lesson is work with the suppliers, work with the contractors, involve them. And you will find that as partners and collaborators, they will help you in this aspect. Doesn't mean you stop working with international organizations, obviously not, but it becomes its own ecosystem where they teach and they train. And then as they pull out and you start operating, or perhaps you're now winding down and you may eventually remediate, what are you leaving behind? So again, this training around the supply chain, the services, the different contracting and procurement, the different buying, that's what you leave behind. And those are good things, because the training, there's much training that can be used by others, not just mines. Obviously, if you're doing very high welding at great heights, you may not need that in somewhere like New Caledonia or anywhere else for that matter. But proper welding, proper construction can be used in any number of areas. So understanding where to find paper bags again, but maybe even being able to make the paper bags. That's how sort of far back you want to think of. You're in part somewhere in Africa where you can actually make bags out of something else than fiber for paper. And so what would that look like? So it's really shifting the mindset. And to do that, what I've found and when I work with my clients and different teams is reverse engineering from where you want to be or where you need to be to today, sort of the net present value of what it must look like. And then as you procure it or you find the supply chain for it, the odds are it's going to fall into that big picture a lot better than perhaps the way we were doing it before. So it may not be um, from Germany or from India, but it works just as well. It's extremely efficient. It can be repaired on the spot, literally, and at the same time, you're contributing to a local plant that makes this piece of equipment or that spare part. Really, really important around sustainability in ESG, particularly in the supply chain, because it is so important, and you will often find it embedded into impact benefit agreements, partnership agreements, collaboration agreements with all of your communities. So supply chain is very center, is making sure that you do highlight what you do and do it well. Um, Reports, I mean, we need reports, absolutely, for a whole bunch of reasons. We need them for our shareholders, we need them for stock exchanges, but make sure the tool that you use is appropriate for the work you're doing and properly highlights all of the successes, and there are many, but also is transparent and highlights some of the gaps and shows the progression. I don't think anybody expects anybody to be perfect, but nobody thinks that everybody does everything the right way the first time. So I'm always very weary when somebody says, well, we need an ESG report or CSR report, or our website says how many people we're hiring. we need to be sure that when we scratch the surface of those statements, we understand what's behind them and when we can stand up to them. The example I'll give you, which has been used and overused probably by now, is the Yukon Gorge and Rio. And I have many very dear friends at Rio, so it's more about they had a number of really, really great reports and tools in place. And unfortunately, there were so many silos within the organization that communication wasn't there, and we know what happened. So it's not about talking about that it is dramatic, but it's more about if that happened to me, how do I make sure that or how do I avoid that happening to me? Or if it did, how do I make sure it never happens again? So the reports are great, but they need to be appropriate to what you're doing. And they also need to be, I will suggest, honest enough that they also help you draw a path for the future. So you're just not pumping out data, but that you again have a strategy and a big picture. So back to that zoom out part, what am I building? What will I be leaving behind? What will the impact be? How do I make sure I build to that and therefore procure to it, source it? So at the end of the day, I'm really walking the talk. So to my last bullet on this page or slide is that ESG is the foundation of the reporting and it's not the result. So a bit of a point I did want to make during this talk. Next slide, Dave. Oh, it's time to finish already. So David, as we close, or just, and I'll get to the bullets, maybe you want to talk about whether it was a washing machine or something else.
Sure. Yeah, it was actually a clothes dryer, but same idea. And it was just another one of these kind of small events where it has big implications. So in this case, it was someone had a lighter in their coveralls that kind of made it into the clothes dryer, and sure enough, it blew up, and then that knocked out the clothes dryer. So then people weren't able to have clean clothes to go to work in the morning, and then again chaos ensued. And a clothes dryer is not something like a critical spare that you'd think to have on site. So it was, maybe a couple of days later when things got reinstalled and back to normal again.
So thank you, Dave. So the interesting one about that made me think, because I thought, well, just go and get another dryer. Well, of course, what happened was that the lighter which had actually gone through the coveralls in the wash, obviously exploded in the dryer and destroyed the whole laundry room. The part that Dave didn't mention that is important was the kind of mine that it was. You had to wear these special kind of coveralls, and that required that you put on a clean pair every day, and then at the end of the day you took them off, and they needed to be cleaned in a particular way. Yet from a health and safety perspective, there was no way you could go and work on that site without these kinds of coveralls. It wasn't like, oh, well, we'll just go and get, go and buy some more or find some more. They really very specific. So again, something as silly as a lighter closed down an operation and a laundry room. Who would have thought? So it literally brought to an almost complete standstill the operations of that mine until they were able to, again, source the right kind of washing machine and dryer and additional coveralls to be able to support the organization. So again, it's about that instant where who would have thought? The risk assessment on it obviously wasn't done. And then literally within an instant, so a bit like our pandemic, overnight, things just are not the same as they were yesterday. So the words that come to mind in closing are really, we're in a world that is disrupted and disturbed, and I think will continue to be. Things will continuously change. Mining does not like change. We all like stability. We all like to understand what we can, we have our habits. So how do we manage, how do we become pliable and flexible, that agility part? And we can. The importance of the interconnection of all the stakeholders, both internal and external. So that those ongoing relationships. I will give you an example there. I was working with a client, which was rather major, and I was helping them update their stakeholder engagement policy for the whole country. And so I was in one of the provinces. I was on at site with one of the buyers actually, and speaking with him and trying to understand. It was this a place where there was an impact benefit agreement. In fact, there were several, but there were also some challenges with the communities. And so I asked one of the buyers. I said, "Well, how are you managing with the process and all, and the communities and this impact benefit agreement had some clauses where if you purchased from the community, there were financial advantages and what have you." So I asked him how he was enjoying it and if he liked working with it. And basically he said, "Lady, my job isn't to talk to anybody in the community. My job is to procure this. And that's part of my job description, and that is part of my KPIs. And it doesn't matter who I buy it from." So I was sort of taken a little bit aback. And so went to the HR person and said, and they knew I was doing this work. So, and said, "Well, help me understand how their jobs come to be, or their job descriptions." And the individual said to me, "Oh, well, look, I just do what I'm told. I will hire if you need an engineer, I'll get you an engineer." And so again, disconnect, no true understanding. I said, "Well, how does this fit into the impact benefit agreement that you've got up?" And wasn't aware, and just, I was told I need this, this, and this, and that's what I make sure I hire. So you would have to talk to the project director. So I sort of worked my way up, realizing the disconnect. And at the end of the day, the project director, who was absolutely lovely and a great person, just said, "Look, I'm stuck to, as we all know, a budget and a schedule." So yes, of course I'm aware. Now this is going back 3 years, and I want to put that in time because time does make a difference. But those are the kinds of conversations we used to hear, and that's why we can't hear those anymore. We need to hear, "Oh yes, it needs to come from the top down," but the bottom needs to be heard when they say, "This is what's happening. Be concerned, be aware, react, and work your way back." So it's a circle even within the organization. Risk assessment never stop. If ever there's something you keep to need doing almost on a daily basis now, is that awareness, that risk. And the risk is about not avoiding it. It's about mitigating and managing. So plan B, C, and D. Leadership, leadership, leadership. And leadership is not just the board of directors or the C-suite. I think we're all leaders in our own way. We all bring to the table experience, knowledge, and we all have an impact and influence on the people around us. And that for me is really leadership. So the ability to be open to new ideas, I hate to throw it in, but I will anyway, diversity and inclusion in all its forms, because ideas come from so many places. And I think that's another one of the great things of what's happening right now in our environments is that listening to what is being said and actually applying it makes huge difference. Of course, sustainability and long-term value and stewardship. So the just in time is just too late. But it is about long-term value. So as we all think of someday pulling away from our mine sites, whether it's 50 years, 20 years, 2 years, what you really want is to make sure that your impacts and your benefits have been good, great, and that you have been stewards. We are privileged in our industry. We're privileged to be in mining. We are accountable to the land, to the people. And it's not motherhood. We want to keep mining. We're going to need to keep mining. So these are huge opportunities to the supply chain world to really make a difference, and throughout that full value chain. So again, think um, solar panel to the first piece of whatever goes into a circuit board for a solar panel. That full value chain, that's what mining's all about. That's where we make a difference, because our minerals are all along the way. And I know we say it and we see it, but living it and delivering it is what we need to do, and keep doing it. So it's really for the long term. It'll keep our share value, of course, good and high, hopefully, but also it'll keep people having faith in the mining industry, and certainly, at least for Canada, or all the places in the world that we do it well, is creating confidence in the industry, rather than having people. I mean, there'll always be people tearing a strip off of us, and that's just the nature of the beast. But we are better. We can do better, and this is supply chain is certainly the tool, I believe, that can help us. And so there you go. That's that value chain, upstream and downstream. So those are my closing thoughts. There's so much more, but I think I'll stop and maybe take questions or whatever. And thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Siri. Yeah, so if anyone has questions, they're welcome to enter it into the question and answer section on the screen share. I just had one quick one. You mentioned kind of getting that local content into your supply chain, and just there may not necessarily be that capacity or that skill set in your local area that you're operating in. So is there sort of an expectation then of time that you have to kind of allocate more time to build up that capacity before you even kind of start your mine construction then? Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Siri.
Um, so when I said earlier, understanding the landscape is that before you even, I mean, if you're already in operation, you know, you want to make sure you know where you're working, and you usually do. But if you're going into that space, you're an exploration company, make sure you do understand, because if you do have to supply certain parts or what have you, or manpower, and they're not available locally, it's about understanding basically what's around and what's available. And if something came to stop all of a sudden, so again, we'll go back to Nunavut, for example, where there's Nico Eagle, TMAC, Baffinland Iron Mines. Everybody made sure the community stayed home. So there were people working, all of the Nunavut were working there, but they no longer could. And I believe for the most part are still at home. So where do you supply? So then it came from the south, as they call it, but then they put in place processes, all of the companies, whereby, and that's where cooperation and collaboration came in, where they moved away from the normal airports, found smaller airports where they can control the flights, the cleaning of the flights, make sure people stayed in hotels 3 nights before, tested. So it's always about, you know, and then when they got there, made sure that they tested again. So it's always that plan B, C, and D. There will not always be people available, even to upskill. Even in New Caledonia, even upskilled, we still needed to bring people in. But it was then again, where do we bring them from? So do we bring them from China, from the Philippines, from India, from Australia? What makes sense, and making sense can change very quickly. So it's again really just understanding what's out there, what's available, and what your opportunities are, what the plan B, C, and D can be. And like I said, that can change on a dime. So continuously challenging that.
Great, thank you.
I'm thinking everybody's fast asleep or already at cocktails, which makes total sense.
cocktail hour. Yeah, that's one thing we miss by doing
I
it.
know the glass of wine.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm just making sure I actually understand this Q&A function myself. But well, in the meantime, if people are wanting to, oh, we have a question from Carlos. It reads as, I think it's all starts with you and me. How can we
Motivate people? I can, well, I think this is a great place to start. So having these conversations, creating awareness, you're absolutely right. It starts with all of us. If we're on a site and we get home at night and we're excited because of a good job that our company did, that you'll talk to your partner, you talk to your kids, that goes back through the schools, that goes back when you go grocery shopping or to the gas station or to the Tim Hortons. It really is, I mean, mining is a really big small community, and for those of us, and especially if you fly in, fly out. I've traveled a lot, and I run into people that I've met 10 years ago. It is a small world. So it's having these conversations and creating awareness. I think to Carlos, it's about creating respect, building trust, and being transparent. And what did when I said earlier, we're all leaders, I really mean that. I think we all, the moment we say we're in mining, besides standing tall and proud as we should be, we need to set that example. So yeah, that's the kind of conversation that we have to have. And what kind of motivation do we need? Waste recycling, it hasn't been that successful today. Well, the recycling part is really important. Mine sites have, the ones I certainly have worked on and been part of, are pretty strict about the recycling. I can tell you that. If you've been to a canteen, for most, I mean, there's always exceptions, but I mean, you do not put a piece of your plastic fork in the same bin as you put your paper plate. I can tell you, people will beat you up if you do that. So, but recycling is important. The concept of recycling is important, and you have to make sure that it's brought into everything you do. And again, it could be as simple as when you go to the grocery store, you take your own bag as opposed to a plastic bag. And I'm going to qualify that statement because now the other day I brought my own bags and was told, no, you can't bring your own bags because of COVID. So I literally put all my groceries into the basket, drove it out, took the basket to the car because, and that's fair too. I totally get it. So that's what I mean. You just have to keep thinking of how do I reinvent what I'm doing. There's a question posted from Luc Saint-Arnaud. I'm fascinated and encouraged by stories where mining clients help suppliers improve their services. Do you think we might see more of those cases? Absolutely. I don't know who asked the question, but absolutely. We're seeing a lot of it. Mining companies, from the biggest ones to the smallest ones, have turned around and worked with suppliers, contractors, and literally said, how can I help? Or can you pay me up front? Can you tell my bank manager that I'm getting a contract? And so that part of the payment goes to the bank manager and the rest comes to me. I mean, there are ways, and there are many ways. And if you need examples, I can find you many. And if you need ways to help, there are. But not paying a supplier because he's late in delivering something because he can't source it himself is not going to help anybody. That's why I'm saying understand your own suppliers, what their supply chains are. Call them up, talk to them. Are you okay? I mean, that simple question, are you okay and can I help? It goes a huge way, and be honest, be transparent. If you're a supplier, I need help. I can't pay my monthly bills. Here are the issues. Here what's happening. Can we work together on this? So I see it more and more. I think it's happening a lot with the communities on the ground. We're seeing a lot of work being done. The Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, That's in the indigenous communities. There are other communities as well. Not perfect yet, but absolutely, we're seeing it happening. So good question. Waste disposal from Antarctica could be a good example, as in what to do, as in what not to do. If you're talking about Georgia, which there have been a number of projects of, it may not be Georgia, but in Antarctica, there have been challenges for sure. I don't know that it's all mining related, but I mean, as human beings, we should be responsible. And even in our own personal supply chains, it starts at home. Your parent or my parents used to say, "Well, it starts at home." It's sort of true. Um, I do things differently today than I used to. I try really hard. I haven't had a plastic bottle of water in my house in ages. I use filters. You start thinking of doing things differently. Um, no plastic bags come into this house. And but remember, we also cannot be all things to all people all the time. We talk about carbon neutral and carbon zero, and those are important, but we also need to understand what that means. Carbon neutral means that in an ecosystem, we all offset each other. But if we don't understand how we work, we won't be able to offset each other. So again, it's reaching out, it's understanding your community, understanding your stakeholders, and working together. But nobody's perfect, and we won't get it 100% right. What's important is again, it's starting from somewhere, committing to a way of doing business, which most mining companies, I will add, do, and at least tracking and following behaviors along. You might choose water, you might choose any one of the SDGs that makes sense to you. It can be diversity and inclusion. It could be diversity and inclusion. I probably said that, I'm sorry. Focused on that a little bit. It could be air emissions. Choose 2 or 3 that make sense to you. Don't choose all 17, and don't misrepresent that you're the perfect company. There are no perfect companies. I mean, but they a couple of things you might want to look at that just happened. Larry Fink from BlackRock just issued his latest letter to CEOs, well worth reading into the detail. It really gives a good game plan of where we want to be as a society. So again, how do we, if we're in the supply chain space, how do we apply that? A big move that happened I saw today was that Exxon is actually, so obviously oil and gas, but similar, are actually seriously thinking of readdressing concerns over climate change within how they do business. I mean, for anybody who knows Exxon, that is just such a huge mind shift. And people would have never thought that would ever happen. And I read that today. So I have hope that our approach to doing business in these kinds of conversations make a difference, and challenging each other. If I said something that was wrong or inappropriate, I stand to be challenged. And we need in the business to be accountable. We cannot mine just any old way. We can't do business any old way. And that's not where our world is going. So I think we're on the right path. So
Question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say, so question from Jacqueline Allison.
Most mines have an adequate feedback system so that the suggestions. For those who don't see it, is that most mines have a good feedback system so that suggestions of all workers can be heard. And I would go one step further and implemented. Again, I don't know all the systems of all the companies. I'm certainly seeing more and more having cross-functional conversations and being open to suggestions that are being put forward. When I said earlier, when you talk, people listen, that is happening. You're seeing that happen more and more at all levels, not just at the C-suite or leadership level, but within the different groups. So procurement groups, somebody might say, I bought this, but it really doesn't work, or it's rotting, or the quality is really bad, and I know we can get something better, or this is really hurting the community, and I know they can do it a different way. Those conversations are happening. They need to be more. What more can be done to enhance the process? It's back to transparency and accountability. At the end of the day, if you're not transparent, it'll hit the ceiling, it'll hit the leadership team, and that will hit your share value. And then all of a sudden your reputation is affected. So organizations, you're starting to see really when you talk about that supply chain, even internally, what's working, what isn't working, and how do we make a difference and how do we do better? So an interface of again, the HR teams, the technical teams, supply chain, the environment teams, the permitting teams. If you want to get local buy-in, if you want to get local permits, you need everybody to work together. It doesn't take very long for a community to say we don't want you here. We're talking, looking at Keystone now. Well, what's going to happen? Regardless of all the politics around it, at the outset, was it started the right way? Were the right conversations being had? So it's being done, but we need to keep doing more. So it's a good question, Jacqueline.
Great.
There's four more.
Four more.
Oh, Jeff. Oh, Jeff is in the room. Great. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate your support. It means a lot to me. I will talk about Jeff for 1 second because it's worth it. When I talk about working on the ground and local procurement, something that Jeff Geipel is doing, so I don't know, is with Engineers Without Borders and Mining Shared Value, and understanding the interface between small and large. Go to his website. He just did some incredible work with another mine in Africa. And you don't have to be in Africa, you can be anywhere in the world. I think the concept, the frameworks apply well. Not only Jeff does good things, I mean, Mac has got obviously towards sustainable mining, and the supply chain has got a big piece. I'd be remiss as a board member of PDAC if I didn't talk about E3 Plus that also addresses it. There are tools out there. We're not using them enough, but there are a number of excellent tools that are free, that are online, that can be used. And if you don't know where to find them or how to use them, you can call Jeff, you can call me. It would be a pleasure to help you. So thanks for that, Jeff. Oh, thank you to Marc, Luc Saint-Anne, and Krish Stories. Oh, great. Do you think we might see more of these cases, Luc? Yes, absolutely. We're seeing them more and more. It's where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The more we help each other, all sort of fill into that safety boat, we all will make it to land, and we're going to build bigger boats and better boats, and or vessels, or whatever you want to call them. Mining has the ability that no other industry has to make a difference. And I mean that from the bottom of my heart. I'm not a geoscientist, but I have seen, and I continue to see, the difference we make in the world. Again, I know we haven't always done it right. There's a long way to go. We've got challenges in artisanal mining spaces, or illegal mining. We saw a gold mine in China with people who passed away. That should not happen today. I would have thought Chile and all the other disasters we should learn. We need to stop beating up on each other and help each other a little bit more. It's easy to say, I know, again, and I'm sure many people did reach out to the Chinese, but I want to read about the good news story. We all want to read about the good news stories, and so yeah, we are continuing to help suppliers, contractors, and we need to continue doing so. So I'm glad we're encouraged. And if this is the first time you've heard about it, there's a lot of stories, a lot of mining companies. There's a long list. I don't want to shout out to some because I'm going to forget the others, but I can tell you there are a lot of them have gone out, reached out, helped, pulled in, paid, supported, and it's just coming back to help. So there is a lot of good happening out there. Jacqueline Allison, do most minds have an ad? Okay, I've got that one already. So I think
I think we covered.
we're done, eh?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if you wanted a minute, you can like sorry, I actually stopped the screen.
Oh, that's okay.
As there was another slide, but it's
so this is
on the course
promotional, but if you want, so this was obviously very high level, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot more behind all of this. If you were interested and wanted to, there is a full program around managing agile supply chains that I'm giving, and I have asked, because it's virtual and I wouldn't want anybody to listen to me for 3 hours. I've invited most of these are friends and colleagues I've worked with around the world, and they will share their experiences and give you some tools and takeaways so that when you go back to your organizations, you can apply them and hopefully make a difference and become more agile. So if you're interested, just click on the link, or you can write to me, or even David, or reach out in any way you feel comfortable, and we'll provide you with the details. The course, however, is on the 17th of February, so it's not too far away. So if you're interested, I would certainly invite you to register.
Okay, thanks, Siri. And
you're welcome.
Yeah, so to close, yeah, I'd just like to thank you so much for sharing your thoughts today. It was a really interesting presentation. I learned a lot, and hopefully everyone else did as well. And
pleasure, I've enjoyed it.
Good. And we have our next speaker is Theo Yam Yogo. He's a partner at E&Y and the mining sector co-leader, and he'll be presenting February 24th at the same time, so 3:30 Eastern. And he'll be presenting the annual top 10 risks that E&Y publishes. It's always quite a discussion piece, so looking forward to hearing what he has to say on that, and hopefully everyone's able to join us for that in about a month from now.
He's a great friend, so go, and it'll tie nicely into our day today. So I think great. I'm looking forward to that. It's a great idea, Dave. So thank you very much, everybody. I appreciate you being there. If you need or want to ask any more questions, please reach out. It's been an absolute pleasure. And have a great afternoon. Stay nice and warm, and of course, stay safe. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks again. Take care.